Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking with Arthur Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter and the founder of the Institute for the Study of Consciousness in Berkeley. Arthur Young is the author of The Reflexive Universe, The Geometry of Meaning, and The Missing Parameter of Science. I think of Arthur Young as a great teacher. Maybe, and I don't know how he feels about this, as a philosopher king. In a previous conversation we had, however, you told me that you don't think that today there really are very many, or maybe any, great teachers. Can we talk about great teachers for a minute? In history, there have been periods when the great teachers were really the leaders of the people.
Well, it's partly because the current age is one of developing individuals. When you teach a person to fly an airplane, the teacher can only go so far. The person has to solo. And that is what's going on now. All the teachers have, well, of course there are lots of people who call themselves teachers, but what I meant by great teachers was that the world wasn't going to be led anymore. It was going to be a field or a school or a platform for, you might say, individuation, for people to learn to think for themselves, because that's really more important than to get a particular doctrine. And now a real teacher helps people to think for themselves. He doesn't just impose a doctrine.
How has that changed over time, or why was it necessary? Is it a part of the evolutionary process?
I think it's part of the evolutionary process. In other words, in an earlier time, most souls, most monads were at a young stage, and they had to be led like sheep, and this was suitable for them at that time. But now just the automobile alone is a thing that gives a great many people a lot of self-determination, a lot of free will, a lot of responsibility, all these things that they would only have if they're acting on their own initiative.
Were the great teachers old souls?
I would say it was a necessary qualification for a great teacher.
Not all old souls were great teachers.
Yeah. And a great teacher is not one who simply stands up and lectures and tells you what to think. It's much subtler than that, much more difficult. So you wouldn't get what I'm talking about from schools or even from current gurus. I don't know too many of them, but what I've seen doesn't look like what I would call great teaching.
So was the whole process of the great teachers and students and people following just a function of another era, which is totally impossible today because of individuality?
Well, that's a good speculation. I wouldn't quite have dared to make it myself. I don't know whether we did it before, but what led to this was the fact that in 51, I think it was, I met this woman who was quite remarkable herself. She was an expert on the esoteric aspects of copper, whatever that means. But she said to me that after 52 there would be no more great teachers. Well, I remembered that, and in 1952 the two great teachers that I knew died, and so did Sri Aurobindo, who I didn't know, but I know was a great teacher. So that finished him off, as it were. I didn't know any others. And that led to this thought that the time had come for man to solo, be on his own. And we're certainly making more mistakes per capita, more mistakes than we ever did. We have the capacity to make more mistakes and hopefully learn from them.
Can we talk about the role of age in all of this? Initially we talked about old souls, but that doesn't mean an old body necessarily. You can have an old soul in a younger body. But there was a time when older people were, for the most part, revered, where because of physical age, you had a certain stature within the community, and people kind of listened to or respected, and in some cases revered people because they had lived more years than others. That doesn't seem to be the case in the individual.
It's a stabilizing influence which we lack now, and I think it's part of the pattern that the self-determination is being encouraged, and this means you don't do just because somebody else told you to do it or the teacher told you to do it.
This is, I know, a tough one for you, but is that a good or a bad thing? You are 80 years old. You are considered elderly as opposed to youngerly.
Well, I certainly wouldn't want people to pay attention to me because of my age or because of my authority or because I knew the truth. My whole purpose about this is to excite their thinking, and it leads to this paradox of teaching. Well, one way to teach is, well, it reminds me of that story of Skelton, who was the tutor of Henry VIII. I don't know whether that's a recommendation or not, but at any rate, he was a pastor, and he was invited, he was supposed to give his sermon, so he asked the congregation, did they understand the subject he was going to talk about? And they said no. So he said, well, there's no use his talking about it then. And then the next time, he asked the same question, and they said, oh, yes, they did. And he said, well, there was no need to talk about it. And the third time, some of them said they knew it, and others said they didn't. So he said, well, let the ones who know it tell the ones who don't. So in a sense, the teacher should do a self-disappearing act. He should remove his support, his water wings, and let people swim on their own. And I haven't found how to do that, but that's what I'd like to do.
Your life spans the era of the great teachers, or at least the latter portions of that era, great teachers.
Well, they're still talking about Einstein as the great genius and all that kind of thing. And I was drawn into that trap when I was in college. I heard that only 12 people understood Einstein, so I wanted to join that exclusive club and asked to have a course. That's through the college authorities, but they managed to come up with a course, and I was the only student, and I tried to study relativity, but that started me off on my own theory, because now I believe he was very, the theory of relativity is not adequate. In fact, I believed even in college that the theory of relativity was not adequate. But that was my initiative rather than something I learned from Einstein. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So you're exposed to things in order to evoke or stimulate your own response, and maybe that's in the form of an activity which Father said don't do. And we go back to I hope I didn't do it before, but the early story of Genesis was that God set up a university to teach people, and it didn't work. So he thought he'd try the opposite and forbade them to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that's been working very well.
There's a tremendous appetite for knowledge when it's forbidden.
Right.
So you went through a period of philosophy and dealing, if we can simplify it, with matters of the spirit, and then you got into a very physical realm in the invention of the helicopter. And then when you came out of that period, after you were able to put that aside and you had a machine that worked, were you able to better feel the relationship between the spirit world and the world of matter?
I had a lot more than I had when I was in college. One thing I could say pertinent there, which is in between the practical and the spiritual, is that I could recognize that purpose was very important to getting the helicopter built. Now, purpose is not a physical, down-to-earth thing, but without it, I couldn't have made it. And Bell couldn't have made it. It took continual effort to turn the aircraft production line to making helicopters. That doesn't seem to have to do with what we're talking about, but it's very close. It has to do with evolution. DNA is supposed to turn out whatever it is, turnips, rabbits, people. And the idea of evolution is, the current view is that there's some kind of chance mutation of this DNA which makes it turn, let's say, a lizard into a bird. But in practice, the airplane didn't turn into a helicopter. In fact, it was almost all we could do to prevent it from turning back into an airplane. We had to use constant vigilance to get the assembly line, i.e. the DNA, straightened out to fly in this new direction. So chance won't create evolution. It's the other way around. All the safeties in the DNA or in nature are to preserve that species, because otherwise chance would have obliterated it long ago. So there has to be something more than chance, or chance has to have some kind of remote viewing capability that we don't give it credit for. Maybe that's where to start the philosophy, that this whole business of remote goals is chancy. You take your chance.
But there is a greater meaning.
You asked me this morning, what was I sure of? Well, I don't give a damn about what I'm sure of. I'm more interested in what I'm not sure of.
When you made it through that period of being totally involved in the physical practicalities and having the purpose of turning out helicopters, then what happened in the interim between then and now?
Well, I got interested in yoga while I was still at Bell because I was frustrated with dealing with management problems. I found more difficult than inventing. And I had to cultivate a calmness that I didn't naturally possess, so I'd do a lot of yoga. And during the yoga practices, which included concentration, I got picking up things happening in the future, including a future dream. And this really knocked me for a loop because my scientific background could contrive no explanation for future dreaming. So it gave more incentive to the philosophy in that now I had some real problems to deal with. So this took me and my wife, we came to California to find out about all these odd things, ESP, radionics, etc. We called it the Gwiz period. And that took 3 years at least, 4 years, before I really settled down and started to work up the theory.
Did you come to grips with the future dreaming?
That came in as part of it wasn't my major concern, but it came in, and I'd like to mention what put me on the track, you might say, because all these different healers, sensitives, people who are dealing with far out and so on, most of them had different kinds of energy. There was bioelectric energy and O-dial, and I've forgotten what O'Reich had, his orgone. There were, I would say, from 6 to a dozen different kinds of energy. And presumably as a scientist I should look into each one of these types of energy and compare it and measure it. Well, you couldn't measure it, and they weren't even defined in the same way. And I noticed that it didn't really matter about the energies, because if this radionics device, which was supposed to work on these peculiar energies, wasn't turned on, it would work just as well, provided the operator thought it was turned on. Or if the operator thought it was turned off, it wouldn't work. So the factor that I distilled from that was that intention was the most important thing. Now, there was nothing in science that recognized intention. So I began to, as it were, restudy science to see if I could find anything that corresponded to intention.
And what is there in science that comes to grips with purpose and intention?
Well, this is difficult, but it's the heart of the problem. A long time ago, 200 years ago, they were first studying light, and they found that light traveled along what was called the path of least action. In fact, light itself caused action at a distance, and this was very puzzling to both philosophers and scientists. There was no way to account for action at a distance. Now, it turned out that it was a long time waiting because they got distracted with heat theory and energy and conservation of energy, thermodynamics, all through the 19th century. But it was in 1900 that Max Planck discovered that action, this is the same action that we're talking about, came in whole units, that is to say quantum. This led to quantum theory. But what's at the heart of it is the same thing that Leibniz and others had noticed, action at a distance. So he had an additional clue about this mysterious action, that it comes in wholes. WHOLES.
Mm-hmm.
Now, then I thought, well, what else comes in wholes? And I've often asked this of people in seminars. They never can seem to answer it, although it seems to me not that difficult. Human decisions come in wholes. You can't decide to get up 1.5 times, or vote 1.5 times, or 1.3146 times. This is unique in science. Everything else can be divided in smaller and smaller pieces, but action comes in wholes. So why couldn't that be the whole from which everything came? In other words, the unity which, when split up, causes plus and minus, shall we say, plus and minus charges. So that's the thesis that I've developed since that time.
And the originating force then is purpose?
Purpose. And it's not correctly described as a force. It's better described as aim, because it has to be supplemented. I mean, suppose you say, I want to get to the top of that mountain over there. You've got to implement that purpose with some equipment. Maybe you have to have a sled or something, a whole lot of things. You want to get to the moon. You have to have enough explosives to push the rocket there. You need other things beside the intent. The intent isn't going to do anything. That's what is important about an invention. It's based on an intent, but you've got to show how you do it. The patent office won't let you patent an purpose. They want to see the mechanism you use.
What about the people that would suggest that we can exist and function on the spiritual plane, and all that you need is that intent or purpose, and that they've been to the moon and back a whole lot of times without any gear?
Well, I'd just say, well, what are you wasting your time down here for then? These people don't appreciate the world as an opportunity to sharpen and increase their competence. And perhaps they're just dreaming they're going to the moon. That isn't good enough. And people ask me about their invention, which they've dreamed up by sitting in a chair. And I say, well, now go to the patent office and find how many other duplicates of this invention there are, and then start. Well, what they do then, if they do it at all, is to go to the patent office, and they do find that this idea is already old, then they give up. But that's the place to start, because once you know what has been done, you can move on from there. Of course, you should also make practical tests, and that's what this world is for. Then you'll really be in a position to get there quicker than the armchair inventors, because almost anyone can be an armchair inventor.
Are there any original ideas?
Yes, I think that's another thing that my theory would indicate, that there's continual creation of new ideas. And the patent office is turning out more patents now than ever, and they're very careful to screen out old ideas from new ideas. You have to have a novel idea or you won't get a patent.
Where did they come from? I don't know that many people, and I'm not sure I know that there are very many people listening that do.
You're playing this game of what's behind the behind the behind the behind. I mean, if I were to say they come from photons, my brother would say, well, the photons come from the sun, and the sun, or somebody else would say it comes from God, and all of that you can perfectly well say, but the point is that a photon from the sun, which might fall on, let's say, Marconi and cause him to invent wireless telegraphy, might fall someplace else and make a plant sprout. The photon is not a sufficient cause of the invention. It might be, and it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. In other words, all right, so they often use the example of a cosmic ray hit one of Queen Victoria's genes, and this caused hemophilia in her grandson, the Tsar of Russia, which caused the Russian Revolution. So therefore, this cosmic ray caused the Russian Revolution. It was not a sufficient cause. It might have been there. Something else. This spark might have. Well, I don't know that answer, but I know that any invention is a contribution of the person.
If you were to blow up an atom to the size of a football stadium, the neutron would be the size of an apple or something. The electrons would be all the way out in the bleachers, the size of grains of sand. What's in between? What's in all that space between the bleachers where the electrons are floating around and where the apples are?
Well, to me, space is only a device for thinking about things. If you say what's in space, then you've got the picture now of electrons and protons in a stadium. I have both spaces superposed, so I'm able to picture what you say. But the space itself, without anything in it, is meaningless. In other words, I would say space is something, a matrix we devised to describe relationship. I want to describe the relationship, shall we say, between this A, B, and C. So I can put them in a line, or I can put them in a circle, put one inside the other. These are different spatial ways of representing relationship. But the space I'm using is, I wouldn't say it's empty, it just isn't, there isn't anything there to be empty.
Why is there so much dissension in the scientific community toward many of the new ideas, which you have, if you have not endorsed them, you have at least taken the time to consider them? And yet when we say, why is it that we can even say scientific community and get a stereotype of people that are not very accepting?
That's a very interesting question, and it's rather difficult to do justice in a short time. I mean, part of it is the fragmentation of disciplines. Now, someone came to see me yesterday with something about interesting rocks they'd found in California, rocks that had evidently been made by some great effort, big rocks on top of little rocks and marked. With it was a 1904 clipping saying how 3 professors at UC Berkeley had endorsed this as an important find, and yes, it was quite significant. But at the present time, they couldn't get any endorsement from archaeologists about these rocks. They were just totally disinterested. Now, there's been a change over time in this freezing of academic barriers so that they're greater than they were. and is possibly due to the fact that science has become so universal and democratized that it's necessary to, in order to make it into a profession and expertise, to keep out amateur thinking and to make it difficult so that each profession can retain its sovereignty. And you get actually where science should be a body of agreement, you get this creating barriers so that they agree not to trespass on one another's territory. This is more policy than it is search for truth.
That seems to butt right up against the idea that we're evolving into an individualistic world.
No, but in order for the individual to come into being, he has to be resisted. This resistance is a very important part of it. And I can't help but think of this thing that came out today, showing Nature publishing this article that astrology had been proved false by scientific evaluation. Well, it reminds me, you wanted to talk about early history. I mean, my early history. When I first was making my own radio, it happened that, the fuse blew. And I traced it to a broken wire in the electric iron that my mother was using, and so stated. My father said, "Oh no, it was your radio." And I said, but I wasn't using the radio even 6 hours from the time. And he said, "Oh well, those fuses sometimes take a long time to blow." Well, this was the beginning of the breakdown of my respect for my father. Now, I always respected my father, but I wouldn't take his word on electricity after that. He didn't know the subject the way I did. And I think that's rather similar. That resistance of my father was very helpful for me to develop my own thinking. And the fact that he was wrong, it was really better than if he'd been right. If he was always right, I would have never gotten a chance to think for myself.
Which kind of brings us full circle and gives an optimistic feeling to me in listening to what you've said, in that invention and creativity and individuality all seem to come out of some kind of frustration. And certainly there's a lot of frustration in the world.
But believe it, there's a life principle that just pushes things on. And if it weren't for this life principle, this frustration wouldn't occur. I mean, what is frustration? It's your inability to get as much as you want. So there must be something behind it that wants more than it's getting. And that's the beginning of understanding of life, because it's insatiable. I mean, evolution, that's the way you explain evolution. It's not satisfied just to be a clam. It wants to be a clam that sticks its neck out. And then it wants to get legs, and then it wants to get wings. It keeps on wanting to surpass itself. And that's the hardest thing to explain, and can't be explained by deterministic science.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.